We have one participant online, and we'd just like to welcome them to the IPC session. If everyone could talk into the microphone, then they'll be able to hear you as well.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I'll proceed from there. So I think in brief, that's my experience. But I think over time, what I've noted is that since we started using IPC, the stakeholders have been satisfied with the results that we have been putting on the table, but also the involvement of the various stakeholders has been on the higher side. You know, one of the principles and functions is technical consensus. You need to bring a lot of stakeholders around on the table to be with you. So each and every year we have managed to do that, getting lots of stakeholders from the UN side, from the academia, but also from the government side to be part of the IPC processes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Imran, I'd like to draw you in just in terms of your experience with the idea of partnership. So someone who sits outside of the state, and in terms of, in a very complex process, groups of actors that come together with very different perspectives, very different understandings of a question around food, allowing evidence to be gathered to follow rules or protocols that allow the convergence of that evidence, and then to follow those same rules to reach consensus. I mean, you've been with an organization, I mean, you can talk through that, but with FuseNet and your ongoing sort of experience, perhaps something about what it's been like working with the Malawian government in a multi-stakeholder process and how the IPC has enabled that. So something in terms of those details. Thanks, Aaron.
Right, thanks. So I think just briefly to speak about partnership, FuseNet has been quite an instrumental partner of the Malawi Vulnerability Assessment Committee, technically speaking, because FuseNet is one of the institutions that has got capacity that probably other institutions do not have in terms of, you know, different approaches of food insecurity analysis. And one of the things I think that we have valued, and you know, speaking from the FuseNet perspective, is we believe in making other people better, because as FuseNet, we normally use secondary data. So we believe in one, you know, assisting stakeholders in you know, kind of improving the way they collect their data, but also the way they analyze the data. And then, you know, as you said, during the process of the IPC, one of the things that we do is we also provide, you know, some inputs into the analysis. For example, we do price projections that are used in the IPC analysis. I know you've talked about building technical consensus, and I mean, this kind of phrase is kind of complex because technical consensus on its own is not something that is achieved easily. But I think with partners that have got a very good understanding of food insecurity, especially, you know, looking at people that have got the context. So one thing that, you know, the Malawi government has done pretty well is they kind of decentralized the process. They started training people from district level. So this is a I mean, it's an advantage in one way, but it's also a disadvantage in another way, in that, you know, when you're doing analysis, as you know, food security is kind of a political kind of thing, right? When figures are, you know, come out, people start pointing fingers at, you know, those participants, and especially if you get people that are from the districts. So the challenge there is you've got people who also want to see that their districts have got figures, people that are food insecure, even despite the fact that they might not be there, but because it's political, there's a lot of politics that is involved. So they would always want to have figures. So to strike a balance between, you know, you getting the advantage of the people that have got the context from the districts to do the analysis in an independent way without even influencing, you know, the numbers that come from the analysis. It's one of the major challenges, I think, that, you know, as Malawi VAC has faced. But I think one of the things that we've done better is there are a lot of indicators that go into IPC analysis. And, you know, for us to come to somewhere where we have a technical consensus. I think we capitalize more on, the context that these people have, because usually before the IPC analysis, it's the same kind of people that go out to do different assessments. They understand. So once we've got like one step in terms of, finalizing, for example, looking at the current figures in terms of the number that are, perceived to be food insecure, you then tend to brainstorm to see, okay, from the stories that came from the assessments, having met people from the district agriculture offices and the results that we are producing, are they speaking to each other, trying to kind of build the story, make sure that the figures are not going one direction, and then the story that we got from, during the time of the assessments are also pointing at a different direction. So it's very difficult to come to a point where you say we have technically agreed these are the results, but I think with a good understanding of the context of the areas, being analyzed, but also with proper kind of training, because during the IPC training, you emphasize that, yes, we are looking at these indicators, but we are not taking the indicators as at face value, because each indicator might be kind of context specific. So we try as much as possible to build on, the contextual understanding of the people that are doing the analysis. So I know I've kind of mixed a lot of other things, but I think for now, let me stop there. Thanks.
Imran, that's great. So I'm going to just pull us back slightly, and I'd like from either of you just a very clear description of what happens with an IPC in Malawi. So in other words, the steps to take us through it, not in the great detail of every protocol or every moment, but from when the data is sort of collated, the organizing on the platform, right through to then what happens at that final moment, so that we all have a common understanding, and then we'll open it up. Two things really struck me about your last comment, your last sort of statements. The one was politics. So what the IPC does is it acknowledges political contestation about this thing called food insecurity, and just how the implications of that and what that means for people's jobs, positions, and indeed the need to be able to have a process that is safe enough for where some form of, shall we call it with inverted brackets, truth emerges. You're able to reach consensus and hold that difficulty. And I think that's very important. And the other thing is, you mentioned that IPC in a way is a form of telling a story. And I think that's very important. There are these great many organizations that are gathering information, building evidence about places, about this question of food insecurity. All of those pieces of evidence are drawn together, analyzed according to context, and a story is told that then informs organizations like the World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the government, so that there can be a response to that situation, whether it's chronic food insecurity and building resilience, which is a term we are using increasingly, or indeed acute food insecurity at a certain classification where you need to bring in food assistance directly. So the implications of storytelling and reaching consensus in politically fraught processes, I think, is some of the really interesting elements of what the IPC is. But as I said, if perhaps you could just, between you, tell the story very briefly of what an IPC analysis looks like, and then we'll open it up. Perhaps even the last one that happened in Malawi.
Right, thanks. So I think one of the basic things that are done in preparation for an IPC analysis is, first of all, you do kind of, indicator mapping in terms of what sort of indicators do we require for an IPC analysis to be done. And then you sit together with stakeholders in terms of planning. When do you think you expect to do an IPC analysis? When is it most needed in terms of the results? And then from there, now you begin to plan, because there are a lot of other assessments that go prior to an IPC analysis, collecting data at household level, even using key informant interviews. So in terms of preparation, you kind of look at what sort of indicators do we need for an IPC analysis, and then how do we collect these indicators, making sure that at least we meet the minimum standards for an IPC analysis. And then you identify sort of, the data sources. Where can we get data from this indicator, which institution, and then you also identify people that would actually contribute, bringing in on the table in terms of those indicators. And then after you've done that, I think that's when you now begin to set dates for, when you expect to do the IPC analysis. But I think after the different, stakeholders that have been identified, one particular thing that I wanted to point out is you kind of look at, so when do we do the data collection? And after doing the data collection, who is going to do the data analysis to come up with the indicators that are going to be used in the IPC analysis, right? So you kind of identify institutions with their responsibilities, who is going to do what, and then you do the assessments, and then you finally do the analysis to produce the indicators that are going to be used in the IPC analysis. And then after the analysis, that's when you take the reports through the authorities for approval. And then once the report is approved, then it's actually then disseminated to stakeholders for their use. I think that's what I can say. Maybe Venancio can add.
Just an addition on the process. He's talked about the data that you need. You already do the data mapping. Then after that, we do stakeholder mapping. We have to make sure that all the relevant stakeholders are there with us at the actual analysis venue. Because if we are to take the risk of having only government officers in the analysis room, that's not going to look nice. So prior to that, we make sure that all the relevant stakeholders have committed to come to the analysis. And after that, we look at who are they sending? Are they sending people that are certified or not? If the majority of them are not, then we have to change our plans and do a refresher training or the full training at the IPC analysis itself, and then we proceed to conduct the full analysis. One thing that Imran has mentioned is that when we are in the analysis room, we have a closed door. The analysis happens in a closed door environment, and then the results are never disseminated out there before they go through the political structures, the government structures. But suffice to say, that's just a formality. What happens is that in Malawi, despite the political pressures and everything else, they know that the Malawi VAC is an independent committee, and that whatever happens in that room never changes. So yes, the results go to the president for him to approve, but he has no right to demand for any kind of change in the results. So I just wanted to add that. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. So the power again of following these processes, understanding the political context, but in fact protecting the integrity of the analysis to then be of use to then a great number of different stakeholders. Colleagues, I'd like to open this up just in terms of any comments, even comments in terms of points of clarity. We are talking about a process that in some ways it takes 5 days of training to become acquainted fully with level 1 IPC analysis. And then one is required to then be part of a full analysis in order to become then certified. So it's a long process. So we chose just to dive straight in and, for us to all quickly swim in this complexity and then to make sense of it together. So any questions, points of clarity, and really just to open it up as much as we can in terms of the side event late on the first day of the Academy Week. Marco.
Thanks very much. Sorry. Thank you very much. Really interesting things that you shared and interesting reflections. So just to ask a few practicalities. So how long does the whole process take? What's the approximate cost? And also is Malawi you seem to have very good infrastructure set up to do this. Would lots of countries in the region again, who are similarly vulnerable to periods of food insecurity have a similar infrastructure? Just trying to get more sense of the practicalities. And I think part of the reason, actually part of the WHO guidelines on severe malnutrition. So we've been trying to highlight the potential value of IPC there, because lots of our recommendations are really dependent on context. And you do one thing in a context of high food insecurity, perhaps recommend something else in a more stable context. So I think really interested in the use, but I realize they don't understand the details and the nuances of the practicality. So I wonder if you can speak a bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so yes, it's correct for us to appreciate the practicalities, but also how much it takes us to do this process in total. So just an estimation. If we have a full house that is fully certified, the analysis approximately takes around 7 days. If we are not doing a training prior, and then the actual data collection exercise itself takes around 2 to 3 weeks. So that's a full national representative household survey. And then also a full market survey, plus also in between we do the household economy approach data collection exercise. So getting to the analysis and everything else, we give ourselves around a month to carry out this exercise. In terms of the cost, it depends on what we have done that year. But if we are to do all the surveys, then we're talking about around $150,000 to $200,000. And then this is something that we have been grappling with the stakeholders in Malawi, that this is way too expensive. But what we have always said is IPC is data intensive, and this has to be rolling data. It's not like you collected data this year and then next year you say we used last year's data. You have to be current. And because of that, we ask for people's commitment. If we are to do IPC each and every year, people have to be committed to the course for us to be having credible results each and every year, and have IPC products that can speak to the truth that is on the ground.
Yeah, just in addition, I think one of the challenges that I've observed over the past couple of years is IPC on its own, it shouldn't be resource heavy. But the challenge is we don't have independent institutions that do this kind of surveys to produce the indicators that are supposed to be used. And then in the end, we are forced into going into data collection, data analysis, and things like those, when in actual fact, we were supposed to, just sit in and do that IPC analysis. The other thing is, I know it's the same case with different other countries. We've been very much reliant on, donor funding. Government puts in a little resource towards these processes, but I think in the end, it is government that consumes the end product of these processes. So I think moving forward, I know the IPC has been in the forefront, ensuring that government at least commits some resources towards these processes. And with the, in the past, there used to be what is known as the Regional Vulnerability Assessment and Analysis Program that used to support countries in terms of resources, but that funding came to an end last year. And currently, I think most of the countries are kind of struggling because there's little government commitment. While we understand government is using the, personnel resource, but in terms of the actual financing of the exercise itself has been, a major challenge. So I just wanted also to highlight on that. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to just highlight that. So the IPC is well established in Southern Africa. So I think most of the 16 member states have embraced it to some extent. So places like Angola may only choose it intermittently. Democratic Republic of Congo certainly is very interested in a particular kind of IPC. Countries like Malawi, Zambia have these rolling assessments very regularly. So it happens not in terms of all of them similarly. South Africa, which has a lot of data, has been very lax, in fact, in following through it, but it was in the center of COVID that it realized the requirements, particularly in terms of densely populated area, and drew in an IPC to then direct the allocation of resources after the assessment. But the Achilles heel, data. and rolling surveys and the challenges that face many countries in terms of having that type of, and we need to be thinking about that very clearly. You had a question. You did not have a question. You did. Would you?
I
Yes.
have a question. Hello everyone. It's so great being in this discussion of, about IPC. I must say this is the first time I'm getting aware of the existence of the IPC, and it is so great that it exists and helps assessing the vulnerability. For instance, in the case of Malawi. Thank you for the insights. You did talk about some challenges that you faced when implementing the protocol, but I'm interested in knowing more about the challenge that are related to the context specific. IPC protocol is something general that has to be implemented into a context specific. Now, when implementing that protocol, did you did you come across some challenges that make you address some recommendations for the protocol? I hope you get the point. For instance, the guidelines have maybe some limitations that you have had struggled to implement in your studies. Have you ever come across come across that challenges? But that's my first concern. The second one is about our second speaker, who talked about both the data mapping and the stakeholder mapping. When hearing you talked about the data mapping first, and then second, the stakeholder mapping. And I was just wondering, what goes first? Is this the data mapping or the stakeholder mapping? Because from my understanding, the stakeholder mapping may come first. I have no idea what the protocol looks like, but it may come first, and some stakeholders may also inform you regarding some data that may not be of your understanding at prior to the planning. Thank you very much.
Yep. Okay. Yep. So I will try to answer to those and partly, and then my colleague is going to. Yep. So in terms of the context specific challenges, we're looking at was the process of consensus building and the actual classification itself. When you look at the classification tables, what are they telling you? And the understanding of the international thresholds. And this is something that we always strive to say we have to understand things in the context of the way they are on the ground. There are some indicators, for example, you look at the food consumption scores or the livelihood coping strategies that might show you that things are worse, but in actual fact, they're speaking to context issues. They're speaking to cultural issues, right? People only eating only pap, and then they're not diversifying. It might not necessarily that they don't have the food. It might be because of the cultural issues. They have a lot of meat, they have a lot of milk, but they're not used to having such kind of meals. So that's something that we also try to understand. That is why my colleague said issues to do with context are important. That's why we have strived to train a lot of district officers into this process, so that when they come in, they provide us with the contextual understanding of all the districts. Yes, you are right. The first thing to happen should be stakeholder mapping, because some of the stakeholders are the ones that will actually provide you with the data. So when we are doing the data collection, when we are planning for it, we already go around to talk to all the stakeholders. For example, in Malawi, we talk to WFP, FuseNet, FAO, and these other institutions in terms of the data that they have. The stakeholder mapping that I made reference to, that I was talking specifically about going to the IPC analysis itself, not necessarily like them not being involved in the data collection exercises. So you are correct to say stakeholder mapping has to start first before you look at what data is available or not.
And maybe just to add on the stakeholder. So this kind of analysis is done through what we call the TWG, the Technical Working Group. So you have a country IPC technical working group where, you identify, kind of sectors that are critical to the IPC analysis. You're looking at livelihood experts, statisticians, you look at nutritionists, you look at agriculturalists, you look at, people from the water sector. So the composition of the TWG looks at, also what type of data do we need and what kind of stakeholders do we need on the table. So this kind of analysis happened in a setting of, the IPC technical working group. To your first question on the context-specific indicators, I know Venancio has already spoken about the contextualization of the indicators. One thing I think, that we've been struggling with, not specifically to Malawi, but in Southern Africa, is that when you look at issues around diet diversification, right, it's actually very poor. So you might have a situation where people are not really food insecure. In terms of their energy intake, they might be meeting the minimum standards, 2100 kilocalories per person per day. But then because their diet is kind of monotonous, they're consuming only, for example, maize and just vegetables, or in rare cases, pulses, right? You see that indicators that measure diet would actually portray a very worse off picture because their diet is monotonous, but not necessarily that we have a very acute food insecurity situation, but because the diet is actually poor. So with that kind of understanding, what we've done in the past is before the analysis itself, we provide a session on each of the indicators that are used in IPC, what they measure, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, where are they more applicable, in what context, because some of those indicators are more applicable in areas that have got, severe acute food insecurity, and others are, kind of more precise in situations that measure acute food insecurity at just the onset, at the start of the acute food insecurity. So what we've done in the past is you do a session on the indicators that are used, what the indicators measure, their weaknesses, their strengths, so that at least you are on the same page to try and simplify that process of building technical consensus. Thanks.
Okay, my question is related to the diverse staple foods or the people used to eat, and generally it is not related to a specific it is related to a specific crop, basic crop that they use to eat, and because the local definition of food security, generally food in the countries, in different regions, you realize that the people are eating different things or have the basic crop related to their foods. And then how did you took this into account in your food security definition?
Yeah, I mean, the working definition of food security is just one, right? Access to, nutritious food for all people at all times, and, things like those. So the working definition is the same, but maybe it's just trying to understand, the food insecurity per se without really going into specifics, because in the end, for example, if you do that analysis, and then you recommend certain interventions, you look at what is being provided as response, right? For example, you've done the analysis, you've produced the number of people that are projected to be food insecure, and then actors come in and just, for example, provide maize and 10 kg of pulses and cooking oil. So even in terms of diversity, it's not really, I know there's an attempt in terms of the response to try and respond to the issues around diversity. But in most cases, I think the concern is, are people meeting the minimum required energy for them to be productive? So there isn't really a specific Malawi definition of food security. The definition of food security is just general.
You don't understand what I'm saying. It's based on my own experiences. We try to understand how people define the food security in the local languages or the area. And we read that, for instance, in Benin, in the south, you have, they say that when they don't have enough maize available to process to eat, and then to process to cook diverse foods, they are in insecurity, food insecurity, and in the north, it's based on yam. Then they try to grow those crops, basically, and then they have those crops in their stock to during the year, to be sure that they have the basic food product that they used to eat. And for them, if the yam is the basic food product, when you provide them with maize, they are in food insecurity.
Yeah, so I think now I understand your question. But I think one thing that I would say is, because in IPC analysis, you know, that perception about food security is actually captured by some of the indicators when you're doing the assessment, right? So that definition would actually be captured by how these indicators, you know, what sort of figures or levels they are bringing, but not, you know, like in an IPC analysis, trying to, you know, look at people's perception about food insecurity, but that they'll be captured by individual indicators, because there are questions related to perceptions about food insecurity within the local context. Scott, would you want to say something?
Yes, I would agree. And certainly also having your district teams that I think would bring some of the more local context for Southern Malawi as opposed to Northeast. Yes, exactly. And bringing those differences, I think, into the analysis, into the room would emerge. I think one of the interesting things is that you have a group of global specialists that follow the rules of the game, the protocol, and you have teams that are trained on those same rules with the deep local context coming together. So both of those knowledge forms, I think, are the intention is to bring both together.
Yes.
Yes.
I asked the question in the document. I see that you study only the maize case, the maize price variation through the year, and then I wanted to know if it is only maize people used to eat here, or the bag potato, or other. So it is the reason why I asked this question.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, you're correct. When we are doing our recommendation and when we are doing the calculations, we do maize equivalent. But we do know that it's not necessarily the maize that can be valued up in the north. There are people value cassava more, while in other areas people value rice. But in terms of the majority of the country, the staple is maize. So in terms of response, for it to be easy, not difficult, we calculate maize equivalent. And even in fact for the projection of the prices, we take the maize to say what will be the projection of the maize at the peak of the lean period. So yes, I understand your concern that maize might not necessarily be the most important staple for the whole country, but for Malawi, the majority, they will take maize. Even if you look at the response that is done, you never see a response in cassava flour or rice. They would largely give them maize as a response to our reports.
Yeah, maybe to build on that last point, it's not a question, it's more of a comment from an outsider, but who has worked around the IPC. So I think it's important to realize that IPC is not to be confused with just the measure of food insecurity. IPC has been actually included to avoid or to reduce or to remove that contested nature of the concept of food insecurity. Because the food insecurity was instrumentalized, because it's a politic concept. That's why the IPC is very useful, because of the consensus that Scott started the discussion with. The IPC is here to build consensus. It builds consensus not just because it brings people around the table. No, it brings consensus because it gives those different stakeholders the opportunity to bring their own indicators. So the ownership process is what builds the consensus among them, because they can't say, oh, you haven't used my indicators, therefore I'm refusing your assessment. You give people the opportunity to bring their own indicators so that the ownership is what builds the consensus. The second aspect of the consensus building is the standardization. Is across the whole Africa, you have one one protocol, which is used by, Senegal, Niger, Congo, Malawi. And it gives the standardization allow them then to make comparison between countries, but also within countries over time. And that is part of the consensus building as well. It's so recognized as technically very useful to make those. But my point was really, if there's one message for me, is that we need to make the distinction between IPC and food and security. Those are two different things. And the IPC is here to remove the contested nature of that food and security concept that people use, as you were really describing. I think it was you, I can't remember, saying like, I'm going to use the level of insecurity in my district to leverage some political power. So to avoid that, that's where the IPC is. My last point is, however, and it's not just for you, but for the other people that work on the IPC, I think we need to also recognize that IPC is essentially capturing processes as the household and community level. And I'm currently advocating for the fact that a lot of the food and security that we see at district level are related to the food system itself and not to the food and security of the household. So I'm advocating for including indicators that capture the resilience of the local food system and not simply the symptom, which is the current status of those households. That would also help bringing a bit of a better forecasting or forward capacity of your IPC protocol, because what happened in the food system is going to eventually lead to the food and security at the households. So when you observe it at the household, it's already too late. If you can capture some of the dynamic at the local food system, you'll probably put yourself in a much more forward-looking capacities to anticipate a bit of these challenges.
So thank you. And I think that really distills and clarifies it very, very beautifully. So thank you for that. Colleagues, it is 6 o'clock. And although we did start late, I don't want to push us too much further. Just one response. The high-level panel of experts suggested an expanded definition of food security that included agency and sustainability. So the IPC's conceptual and analytical frameworks are built on the four domains of food that we know so well: availability, access, utilization, and stability. But there's now a serious consideration of actually what does considering agency and sustainability mean for the IPC? And I think it talks to these elements of resilience. And just in itself, this is a deeply unnerving conversation, because it really does mean a rethink about some of these frameworks. But you're right, it's that system, and it's how that system interacts over time that is then creating this thing called acute or chronic food insecurity. So I really appreciate that final comment. Colleagues, with that, if there are final comments, perhaps from our two speakers, just in terms of a wrap up, any final words, perhaps invitations to join a training or something of that nature, and then we can wrap up for sure.
No, we're happy that we are invited to share our experiences here. Malawi still remains committed to IPC since 2016 going forward. We have each and every produced our results using IPC. We are going into analysis next week using IPC as well. So going forward, we'll be using IPC. We also have a chronic report that we disseminated last year. Yeah, welcome to look on the website, IPC website, for our chronic report. Thank you.
Just like Venancio said, I think we'd like to thank ANH for inviting us to this kind of roundtable discussion. In concluding remarks, I would say one of the value additions to the IPC that we've seen over time is that it enables decision makers to make better use of resources where they are needed most, because you're looking at, for example, if you're looking at countries, you're looking at the countries using the same lens, you're weighing them using the same scale. So you look at which areas facing severe food insecurity, and in that way they prioritize resource allocation based on that severity. And that's one of the best value additions that we found from the IPC analysis process. So thank you.
Thank you all very much.